Beneath the surface of recorded history lies a name rarely spoken, a presence hidden in the folds of time. The Order of the Eternal Watch, an ancient brotherhood whispered about in fragments, half buried in forgotten manuscripts and coded symbols, carved into stone. Who were they? Guardians of a secret too powerful for kings and empires to hold, or conspirators weaving unseen strings across centuries? Their traces flicker like shadows on the edges of war, religion, and power, always present, but never fully seen. Tonight, we peel back the layers of silence, chasing fragments of evidence scattered across continents, following the faint trail of a society that vowed to remain unseen, yet has never stopped watching. The first known trace of the order does not appear in any grand chronicle or royal decree, but rather in the brittle margins of a forgotten manuscript stored deep within the Vatican archives. The text itself, a theological treatise from the late 9th century, makes only a passing reference to a circle of watchmen who never sleep, who guard what should not be revealed. Most scholars, encountering the phrase centuries later, dismissed it as metaphor monks describing God's omnipresence. Yet, closer examination of the handwriting revealed something more unusual. The words describing the watchmen were written in a different ink, a darker shade, as if added not by the original scribe but by someone else, someone determined to leave a clue. This strange hand appears in other texts from the same era, scattered across monasteries in France, Germany, and Spain, always leaving cryptic references to a brotherhood that seemed to exist beyond the edges of the church's official story. What that makes this trail all the more compelling is that the descriptions are never consistent. In one account, they are protectors of relics, shielding sacred objects from falling into the wrong hands. In another, they are portrayed as shadows among crusaders, guiding battles yet never taking credit. And in darker tellings, they are portrayed as manipulators, men who operated unseen, shaping outcomes of wars and councils, their loyalty owed to no crown and no cross, only to their own silent oath. Such contradictions are what fueled the mystery. Were they protectors, deceivers, or something in between? The first tangible evidence comes from a crumbling parchment unearthed in the ruins of a Cistercian abbey in Burgundy. The parchment contains a list of names, but unlike most records of the period, the names are not linked to landholdings, vows, or clerical duties. Instead, each is paired with a strange symbol, a circle split by a vertical line. At first glance, it resembles the simple mark of a mason or a builder, but repeated across different contexts, its recurrence is too deliberate to be coincidence. That same symbol has since been identified on stone lintels in forgotten chapels, etched into cornerstones of fortifications, even scratched faintly into the walls of prison cells where political prisoners once awaited execution. Always hidden, always small, but always there. The circle and the line, the silent mark of the eternal watch. It is in the 12th century, during the height of the Crusades, that the order emerges more forcefully, though never by name. Chroniclers of the time write of the Pale Riders, men cloaked in grey, who appeared at nightfall in the camps of crusading armies. They were said to bring intelligence, knowledge of enemy movements, secret passes through treacherous terrain, even warnings of betrayal within the ranks. Yet curiously, these riders never remained after their information was delivered. No chronicler records their banners, their allegiance, or their origins. Some knights believed them to be angels, others whispered of demons, but in the shadows of these uncertain accounts, one begins to sense the hand of an organization that thrived on secrecy and influence, one that sought not glory but control from the unseen. One such tale survives from the siege of Antioch in 1098, when crusading forces found themselves starving, surrounded, and close to annihilation. A single knight's journal recounts how, on the eve of surrender, a group of cloaked figures slipped through the camp. They carried maps of hidden wells beyond the city walls and described a concealed passageway through the cliffs. Acting on their instructions, the Crusaders mounted a desperate sortie that turned the tide. The official chronicles attribute the victory to divine intervention, but the private notes, never meant to be read by others, leave little doubt. Someone else was there, shaping the outcome, unseen yet decisive. The pattern repeats itself across history. At the Council of Constance in 1415, where the Church sought to end decades of division by resolving the Great Schism, a series of mysterious interruptions plagued the proceedings. Certain documents vanished overnight, votes shifted unexpectedly, and when Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer, was condemned to die despite promises of safe conduct, whispers spread that hidden agents had orchestrated his downfall. A friar's secret diary, found centuries later in a German library, speaks of the eternal sentinels who guided the council's hand. Again, there is no name, no open declaration, only the suggestion of a brotherhood watching, intervening when the balance of power teetered. Skeptics argue, of course, that such scattered references can be explained away. Coincidence, exaggeration, or the human tendency to invent hidden forces where none exist. And yet the consistency of the imagery, the watchers, the guardians, the silent figures who never sleep, creates a pattern too precise to ignore. Even more unsettling is how the symbols attributed to them resurface in unexpected places. In Prague, For instance, a church bell cast in the early 15th century bears an inscription that scholars long considered meaningless, Vigilantes e. Only in recent decades was it translated, the Eternal Watchers. Who commissioned such a bell, and why, remains unanswered. The trail grows darker in the 16th century as Europe convulsed with religious wars. Reports from both Protestant and Catholic sides describe the sudden appearance of Grey Brethren, who offered counsel to generals and monarchs alike. They seemed to possess knowledge of troop movements days before they occurred, as though they were everywhere at once, always listening. Strangely, neither side ever accused the other of harboring them. Instead, both sides spoke of them with unease, as if acknowledging their presence without daring to claim them. The result was a chilling implication. The order did not serve factions or faiths. It served only its own enduring mission. Some have theorized that the Eternal Watch was born out of necessity in the early medieval period, perhaps founded by monks, who believed certain truths were too dangerous for mankind to handle. Others suggest a military origin, a splinter group of warriors who swore to guard a hidden relic, their oath persisting long after memory of the relic itself had faded. But these are only guesses. The order itself never left a manifesto, never announced its creed. Its existence lingers only in these shadows pieced together from fragments, each one whispering of a force that shaped events while remaining hidden. The most compelling fragment of all is a letter discovered in a private collection in Florence, dated 1572, in the midst of the brutal St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It describes a council of unnamed men who met in secrecy to preserve the balance when blood flows unchecked. The author speaks of oaths older than kings, older than Rome itself, and warns that should the watch ever falter, the world would drown in its own chaos. What is striking is not only the certainty of the writer but also his fear. It is as if he were confessing knowledge of a power far greater than himself, a power he dared not oppose yet could not fully serve. And so the question persists, as it has for centuries: who were they? A brotherhood of protectors, or a conspiracy of manipulators? Their trail is a lattice of half-truths and silences, yet it leads us always back to the same symbol, the same whispers of watchmen who never sleep. To follow it further, we must step into darker corridors of history, times when nations collapsed, revolutions burned, and unseen hands guided the outcome toward purposes no one dared to name. To step deeper into the order's presence, we must look to the crucible of revolution, when thrones toppled and empires dissolved under the weight of the people's rage. The 18th century was an age of upheaval, and within the cracks of collapsing monarchies, faint traces of the Eternal Watch appear again, not in official proclamations but in whispered accounts of inexplicable interventions. The French Revolution, in particular, bears marks of a hidden hand steering events behind the storm of public fury. In the memoirs of a minor clerk who worked at the Hôtel de Ville in Paris during the bloody summer of 1793, there is an odd passage. He writes of men who came and went with no record of entry, no affiliation with the revolutionary committees, yet who whispered instructions that were carried out without question. Their advice seemed prophetic, predicting which generals would betray, which districts would rise, which prisoners must not be executed too soon. The clerk describes them as faces pale as parchment, voices neither hurried nor hesitant, speaking as if they had watched this all unfold before. His notes were dismissed for centuries as the paranoia of a man terrified by the guillotine's shadow. Yet when one compares his words to scattered police reports of unknown advisors seen at key trials, the resemblance becomes too strong to ignore. Even more chilling is a record from Lyon, where a group of revolutionaries swore that they had been guided by strangers during the uprising. These strangers disappeared once the bloodshed ended, leaving behind nothing but a scratched symbol on the door of a meeting hall, the same circle split by a line. Faint but deliberate, the hall later burned, the symbol lost, yet sketches survive in a police file, preserved almost accidentally. Why would unknown men leave such a mark, unless it was part of a code known only to themselves? Across the Channel, Britain's political elite grew uneasy as whispers spread of the French chaos spilling into their own streets. Among the private papers of Lord Shelburne, discovered long after his death, a curious entry appears. The Watchers are here too. They offer counsel, but their loyalty is to no parliament. They speak of equilibrium, of guarding against extremes. Historians debate whether this was metaphorical, a reference to foreign spies or secret societies like the Freemasons. Yet the phrasing "the Watchers" echoes to precisely the language traced through centuries. If Shelburne truly encountered emissaries of the Eternal Watch, it suggests their reach was not confined to one land, but spanned across nations, moving silently wherever history threatened to tip out of balance. The 19th century only deepens the enigma. As industrial revolutions reshaped societies and empires carved new borders, the order's faint signatures followed the shifting tides of power. In 1815, as Europe reeled in the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat, delegates gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of the continent. Official minutes portray endless debate among diplomats, but in the private correspondence of Prince Metternich, there is a strange confession. There are those in these halls who hold no seat, yet all defer to their counsel. They are nameless, Yet when they speak, even the proudest ambassadors fall silent. Could Metternich have encountered the watch, guiding the outcome of Europe's fragile peace? He never names them, but his words suggest the presence of an invisible authority, neither sanctioned nor resisted, simply accepted. Travel eastward, and the pattern continues. During the failed Polish uprisings of the 1830s, rebel leaders claimed to have received guidance from mysterious benefactors who knew in advance when Russian troops would advance. Some swore these benefactors were traitors once the revolts failed, yet others maintained they had only tried to prevent slaughter. One underground pamphlet, circulated secretly in Warsaw, accused the Order of the Eternal Watch of deliberately ensuring the rebellion would fail, keeping Europe's balance intact. By preserving Russian power, it is the first time the name appears explicitly in print, though most historians dismissed it as the invention of desperate rebels seeking scapegoats. Still, the pamphlet remains a haunting clue. By the 19th century, the order had stepped from pure shadow into rumor, its name whispered aloud, if only to explain outcomes no one else could. By the late 19th century, the order's alleged presence intersects with one of history's darkest frontiers, the rise of global empires. In colonial records from India, there are strange mentions of Europeans unaligned with any crown, moving among local leaders, offering advice in crises yet never leaving behind names or allegiances. A retired East India Company officer, in his private journal, wrote of a group of grey men who warned him of a mutiny weeks before it erupted in 1857. He ignored them, believing them to be when the rebellion broke out and entire garrisons fell, he admitted in writing, they knew more than any spy could have known. His words were locked away, unpublished, found only by accident in the attic of a descendant's home. The entry offers no proof, yet it aligns uncannily with the watch's long tradition, always appearing before history's breaking points, never claiming responsibility, leaving only fragments of testimony. The century closed with one more unsettling trace, this time in the United States, in the years after the Civil War, as the nation struggled to rebuild. A senator from Massachusetts delivered a private letter to his son, warning of men who stand beyond party or state, who speak with knowledge of outcomes before they arrive. The senator cautioned that these men were neither allies nor enemies, but something altogether different. They believe themselves guardians. But I tell you this, their guardianship is not for us, nor for our republic. It is for something older, something unseen. The letter was never meant for public eyes, yet, when published decades later, it reignited debate about whether America had been quietly observed by the same brotherhood that had haunted Europe for centuries. Skeptics, of course, argue that all these fragments can be explained through the lens of conspiracy theory. Human beings, they say, invent hidden forces when faced with chaos, because randomness is unbearable. The Order of the Eternal Watch could simply be the ghostly projection of humanity's fear stitched together from coincidences, hoaxes, and paranoia. Yet, if that were true, how do we account for the recurring symbol, the circle split by a line etched into stone, scratched into wood, appearing in places scattered across centuries and continents? Coincidence struggles to explain repetition, so precise, so deliberate, so enduring. Perhaps the most unnerving suggestion arises not from what the Order did, but from what it did not. Consider the revolutions of 1848, when Europe was engulfed in uprisings from Paris to Vienna, from Berlin to Budapest. Governments fell, barricades rose, yet within a year, most of the revolutions collapsed, replaced by order restored almost too neatly. A handful of memoirs from revolutionaries speak of men in grey who counseled restraint at critical moments, urging leaders to avoid bloodshed that might bring foreign intervention. Strangely, those who heeded the advice often found themselves betrayed by history, their causes undone. Were these interventions meant to preserve life or to ensure failure? Did the Eternal Watch prevent disaster or guarantee it, maintaining a balance we cannot fully see? This duality is what makes their shadows so haunting. They appear not as heroes nor as villains, but as something outside our categories of morality, bound to a mission we do not understand. Were they striving for peace, or merely for the preservation of a hidden equilibrium at any cost? To those who lost revolutions, they were saboteurs. To those spared massacres, they were saviors. But to themselves, they were something else entirely, eternal, guarding secrets too vast to entrust to nations or kings. And as the 19th century gave way to the dawn of the 20th, the stakes would only grow higher. The world was hurtling toward wars unlike any before, wars where the very survival of nations would hang in the balance. If the Eternal Watch truly existed, their silence could no longer remain untouched. The shadows would follow into the trenches, the councils of war, and the fragile treaties that bound a fractured world together. History was about to enter its bloodiest century, and if the Order had guided humanity before, its presence in what came next would be impossible to ignore. The 20th century opened like a storm. Nations armed themselves with technologies unimagined by previous generations, while empires stretched across continents, brittle beneath the weight of their own ambition. It was an age of revolutions, assassinations, and wars that left entire landscapes scorched. And yet, within this chaos, faint but persistent traces of the order of the Eternal Watch appear again, as if their oath to remain hidden could not withstand the pull of a century that demanded choices. In silence, they stepped into the most turbulent moments of modern history, unseen but never absent. The first whispers surface in the years preceding the First World War. In 1912, a Serbian archivist stumbled upon a coded diary belonging to an officer tied loosely to secret nationalist groups. Among the cryptic entries, one passage stood apart. It spoke of pale advisors who urged restraint, warning that a single bullet could ignite the collapse of empires. Less than 2 years later, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, and the world plunged into war. Had the Eternal Watch foreseen it? Or had they tried, unsuccessfully, to prevent it? The diary was dismissed as the ramblings of a frightened soldier. Yet the haunting accuracy of its prediction lingers. Someone somewhere understood how fragile the world had become. Once the war erupted, rumors of unseen guides followed armies into the trenches. Soldiers wrote of strangers who appeared in villages before battles, offering quiet warnings of artillery strikes or urging commanders to delay their advances by hours that later proved critical. These figures never gave names, never accepted payment, and vanished as quickly as they appeared. In official records, no such men exist. But when letters from British, German, and French officers are compared, a strange consistency emerges. Or describe them as wearing grey or dark cloaks, their words calm and precise, their knowledge beyond reason. It is difficult to dismiss so many independent accounts, scattered across enemy lines, yet echoing the same detail. The watch was there, moving silently through the war without allegiance to any flag. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was meant to secure peace, but behind the grand speeches, unease lingered. Private notes from an American delegate reveal a troubling line. There are voices in these halls who speak not for France, nor Britain, nor America, yet their influence bends the table. They urge balance, but the balance they describe is not ours. The note offers no names, but the implication is clear. If the Eternal Watch shaped outcomes in Versailles, it was not to serve nations, but to preserve an equilibrium that only they understood. The resulting treaty, as history proved, sowed seeds of resentment that would soon grow into something darker. Were they preserving balance or deliberately maintaining instability to ensure humanity never escaped their quiet oversight? The 1930s brought fresh shadows. As fascist regimes rose across Europe, a handful of secret police reports mention anonymous informants who delivered intelligence of uncanny accuracy. A German report from 1936 describes an unidentified man who warned local officials of an assassination attempt on a Nazi leader. The attempt failed. Yet, in a chilling twist, some historians argue that the warning itself allowed the regime to tighten its grip, accelerating its brutal consolidation of power. The Eternal Watch's role, if it was truly them, remains ambiguous. Did they try to prevent chaos, or did they ensure the machinery of terror remained intact? The Second World War cast humanity into its darkest abyss, and here too the shadows of the watch flicker. In occupied France, members of the resistance told stories of cloaked figures who appeared briefly in their safe houses, delivering maps of German patrols or coded instructions on sabotage. Some dismissed them as British agents. Yet survivors insist these men spoke with accents belonging to no nation, their manner calm, detached, almost unnerving. One resistance fighter, decades later, described them as men who looked as though they carried centuries in their eyes. Similar accounts surface in Poland, where survivors of the Warsaw Uprising recall receiving whispered directions from strangers who vanished before the first shots rang out. Whether these interventions saved lives or led fighters into traps remains impossible to judge. Most disturbing is a declassified Soviet file from 1944, buried for decades in Moscow's archives. It details an interrogation of a captured German, an officer who spoke of grey advisors attached to high command. They were not uniformed, yet generals listened to them. When pressed, the officer insisted they were neither German nor Allied, but something older, their authority unquestioned. The interrogator dismissed him as delirious. Yet the file includes a sketch made by the officer under duress, a circle split by a vertical line, the same symbol seen across centuries, resurfacing in the heart of humanity's bloodiest war. When the war ended and the world split into East and West, the watch seemed to vanish again, but only on the surface. Cold War paranoia was fertile, ground for rumors, and within intelligence circles, stories circulated of a third force, neither Soviet nor American, that intervened quietly to prevent full annihilation. One CIA memorandum, later declassified with heavy redactions, mentions an unverified advisory presence during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. According to the document, a nameless intermediary delivered critical intelligence to both American and Soviet officials, urging restraint. Neither government ever admitted to such a channel, yet some historians speculate that without it, the confrontation might have escalated into nuclear war. If true, the Eternal Watch may have saved millions, yet their intervention was never recorded, their name never spoken. In the decades that followed, Smaller fragments continued to surface during the civil unrest of 1968. Students in Paris claimed that among their number were older men who spoke of revolutions past, warning that some paths would lead only to bloodshed. In South America during the years of brutal dictatorships, exiled dissidents spoke of strange benefactors who offered false passports and escape routes. In Africa, during decolonization, tribal leaders recounted encounters with foreign advisors, who offered knowledge not of politics, but of survival, how to preserve heritage amid the collapse of empire. Each account is unprovable, dismissed as rumor or invention, yet the recurrence of the same descriptions, in different continents, in different decades, suggests a continuity too strange to ignore. What emerges is a chilling paradox. If the order of the Eternal Watch exists, then their mission cannot be reduced to good or evil. They have prevented wars, yet also ensured the collapse of revolutions. They have whispered life-saving warnings, yet also reinforced the power of tyrants, always present, always watching, but never choosing sides as humanity understands them. Instead, their loyalty seems bound to an idea beyond nations and ideologies, an eternal balance, the preservation of something hidden, something older than the very conflicts they intervene in. By the late 20th century, as the Cold War drew to its uneasy close, a handful of retired diplomats began to speak more openly. One British ambassador, in his unpublished memoirs, wrote of advisors without identity who appeared at summits and disappeared without explanation. He admitted he did not know who they served, but confessed that, on more than one occasion, their guidance proved decisive in preventing catastrophe. They did not ask for recognition, he wrote. They demanded only that we listen. And in listening I came to believe we were part of a story far older than we knew. As the century turned and humanity stepped into the 21st, the fragments of the Eternal Watch did not vanish. Instead, they seemed to shift once again, following the world into new arenas of conflict, not on battlefields of mud and fire, but in the invisible realms of information, surveillance, and global networks where wars are fought in silence and shadows. As the 20th century ended and a new millennium dawned, the world entered an era shaped not only by armies and governments but by invisible flows of information, currents of data, surveillance, and secrets carried across fiber optic cables and satellites orbiting in silence above the Earth. If the Eternal Watch truly existed, their centuries-old oath could not remain confined to battlefields or councils of war. To survive, they would have had to evolve, slipping into these new frontiers of hidden power. And though no historian will admit it openly, fragments of evidence suggest they did just that. In the aftermath of September 11, 2001, chaos swept through the corridors of intelligence agencies. Fear and confusion reigned, and in the midst of it, odd rumors surfaced of warnings given but never understood, of obscure messages traced to no nation yet passed through channels reserved for high-clearance operations. One retired NSA analyst, speaking anonymously years later, claimed that an encrypted transmission appeared on multiple systems days before the attacks. The message contained only one phrase, repeated in a dozen languages: "The Watch has spoken." The analyst dismissed it as a hoax, yet swore that the code used was unlike anything known, as if written in a language that combined ancient cipher with modern encryption. The file was purged from official records, leaving behind only the analyst's haunting testimony. During the wars that followed, scattered accounts from soldiers and contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan describe encounters with figures who did not belong, men and women dressed in civilian clothes, speaking in measured tones, offering guidance that saved entire patrols from ambushes or warned of attacks before they happened. They carried no identification, no insignia, and when pressed, they simply vanished into the dust. Some believed them to be Allied intelligence operatives. Others insisted they were something older, something that had always been there, moving silently through the flames of conflict. The descriptions, calm, detached, with an unsettling certainty in their words, mirror testimonies from centuries earlier. But perhaps the most chilling sign of the Order's endurance comes not from the battlefield, but from the world of finance. In 2008, as global markets collapsed, documents emerged from a Swiss bank later dissolved under scandal. Among them was a sealed memorandum, unsigned, but bearing the now familiar symbol, a circle with a vertical line. The memo warned of the collapse months before it occurred, predicting its cascading effects with uncanny precision. It concluded with a line that baffled investigators: "The balance must be preserved, even through ruin." Who authored the document remains unknown, but its presence in a financial vault suggests that the Watch, if real, had extended their influence into the hidden architecture of the modern world, not just wars and revolutions, but the very system that underpins global civilization. In the digital age, their alleged appearances became stranger still. Cybersecurity experts across different nations have spoken, in hushed tones, of encountering code unlike any they had seen before. Programs that appeared not to steal or destroy, but to correct, to stabilize networks on the verge of collapse, to prevent cascading blackouts during cyberattacks, to block hidden malware seconds before a triggered catastrophe. These interventions were never claimed by any state, never attributed to any corporation. Yet those who studied the code said it carried a signature elegant and ancient in its logic, written as if by hands accustomed not to modern keyboards, but to quills and ink, transmuted across centuries into the digital ether. Once again, the whispers began. The Eternal Watch had entered cyberspace, not as conquerors, but as guardians or manipulators, preserving a balance no one else could see. What is most unsettling is how their presence seems to emerge at the edges of disaster. In 2011, when nuclear meltdown threatened Fukushima, several engineers reported receiving anonymous schematics blueprints that highlighted structural flaws in cooling systems. The blueprints proved accurate, yet no one could identify their origin. In 2020, as the world faced a pandemic, physicians in multiple countries spoke privately of receiving packets of data, sealed and untraceable, offering models of viral spread weeks before official agencies produced their own. The information was precise, almost prescient, yet its source was never revealed. Some dismissed it as underground researchers or whistleblowers. Others wondered if the watch had shifted once again, no longer moving only through halls of power, but through the veins of science, medicine, and technology. And still, the old question lingers. Are they protectors, or are they something more sinister? If they can prevent catastrophe, why do they allow so many to unfold? If they can foresee collapse, why do they not always intervene? The pattern is the same as it was in the Middle Ages, in the wars of Europe, in the revolutions of the 19th century. They step forward only at certain moments, when balance itself seems to teeter, never to end suffering, never to guarantee peace, but to ensure that the hidden equilibrium they guard remains intact. To some, this makes them saviors. To others, architects of humanity's endless turmoil. What truth lies behind the order of the Eternal Watch? Perhaps they began as guardians of a single relic, long forgotten, their oath extending centuries beyond the object's memory. Perhaps they are descendants of exiled scholars, sworn to protect knowledge too dangerous for kings or common men to wield. Or perhaps most chilling of all, they are not bound by relics, nations, or even humanity itself, but by an idea that stretches beyond our understanding, that history must be managed, not by chance, not by chaos, but by those who never sleep, those who never step into the light, those who have always been watching. The last verifiable trace comes from 2017, hidden in an obscure leak of government files. Buried among thousands of pages was a single document stamped with the word unconfirmed. It described a meeting in Geneva where unnamed men presented intelligence on global security threats. The document's author admitted confusion. These men were not listed in any diplomatic register, nor attached to any agency. And yet, officials from multiple nations listened to them without objection, as if their authority was unquestionable, as if their presence was known, but never acknowledged. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting rather than type, someone had scrawled a single phrase: "The watch endures." If true, then the order has never left. They are here still, moving through the invisible veins of our modern world, shaping outcomes we cannot yet see, ensuring balance for purposes we may never comprehend. Their symbol lies etched in history, their whispers buried in forgotten letters, their presence flickering in every century where chaos threatened to swallow order whole. And perhaps even now, as you hear these words, they are watching still, eternal, unseen. For more untold truths, keep watching The Forgotten Cell.